Now today we're back to what was on radical feminism. We're getting started. It's not 3 o'clock, almost pretty close to it.
Okay, good afternoon and welcome back to our series on neo-Marxism and feminism, and we'll continue where we left last Friday. Betachbulot ta'aseh lecha milchama. Well, I don't know how my Hebrew sounds, but this was Mossad's original motto, and translated into English means, by way of deception thou shalt do war. This is actually a phrase from the Bible, Proverbs 24:6. And no, I don't want in any way to imply that conspiracy or something, that modern feminist movement is creation of Mossad, but I just like this phrase because feminism also masquerades as a movement ostensibly for women's rights, but it is a deception. This kind of deception is typical of subversive movements of communist origin. And today, because it turned out that we'll continue this next Friday also, so I moved all nasty stuff, all statistics that show not the roots but fruits of feminism to next Friday, and today we'll devote this session to what in American journalism is called human interest stories. So I will tell 2 stories about 2 real persons behind feminist movement, and one would be after, questions after. Radical feminism, new feminism, second wave feminism, Marxist feminism, any feminism. So the first one will be from the old left, Betty Friedan, and another from new left, Andrea Dworkin. And it can be said that the course of American history was changed in 1963 with the publication of Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique. And I showed you this book last Friday, and I said that I started reading it, and while I can't say that I succeeded in much, now I'm on page 62, and it's torture to read, but I will succeed reading this book because I don't want just to look like that young fellow a few weeks ago who said that in order to criticize Mein Kampf, he does not necessarily has to read it. Well, if I talk about the book, so at least what I can do, I can read that book before talking. So over 5 million copies of this explosive book eventually would be sold, and it is widely credited with, or blamed for, depending on whom you talk to, launching the modern feminist movement in America. Well, it definitely made Friedan herself a celebrity, that's for sure. Her book eventually was translated into a dozen languages and is currently regarded reading in hundreds of college courses worldwide. The Feminine Mystique is widely regarded as one of the most influential non-fiction books of the 20th century, the ultimate Zeitgeist book, the Bible of modern feminism. In 1976, a New York literary club included it along with works by Galileo, Marx, and Mao Zedong in its exhibit called Books as Troublemakers, about books that stirred millions of people and changed their lives. In her obituary following the death of Betty Friedan, Associated Press writer Hillel Italy summarized Friedan's book in these terms, I quote, "Few books have so profoundly changed so many lives as did Friedan's 1963 bestseller." Anna Quindlen, a journalist and novelist, in her introduction to the most recent paperback edition, this one, proclaims that this book changed her life and that of millions upon millions of other women. Anthropologist Ashley Montague said that Friedan's book was, and I quote him, "the wisest, sanest, soundest, most understanding and compassionate treatment of American women's greatest problem." End of quote. This is why Betty Friedan herself is universally regarded as a founding mother of modern feminism, the architect of the contemporary feminist movement in America. Well, in October 1966, Friedan indeed played a leading role in founding the National Organization for Women and other groups promoting what in fem-speak is called women's liberation. The controlled media, of course, hyped Friedan to the heavens. She was celebrated as sort of new oracle. In 1975, Friedan was named Humanist of the Year by the American Humanist Association. She even was elected to the National Board of the Girl Scouts. Thereafter, she received numerous honorary doctorates at Harvard, Yale, Columbia, and other universities. More than 4 decades later, Friedan, already dead, remains a larger-than-life figure to both friends and foe, a feminist matriarch, or a false prophetess, who led American women out of their happy homes. Central to the appeal of the feminine mystique was the idea that the author was writing from her own experience. American women purchased the book in droves because the author presented herself as just an average housewife, pretended to be a typical 1950s American mother and wife who had a revelation that women like her were exploited and oppressed. Friedan argued that millions of American housewives found the destiny of mother and housewife which society mapped out for them stifling, repressive, and even dehumanizing. The argument of mystique was that women were utterly ensnared by husbands and families and housework, which stultified, degraded, and yes, even dehumanized them. The feminine mystique has succeeded in burying millions of American women alive, she says in her book. Author wanted to make the impression that her book emerged principally from, I emphasize, her own suburban captivity. In the book, Friedan claimed she had lived in how she calls it a comfortable concentration camp of New York City suburbia. By her own account, she was a fellow sufferer of the middle-class woman in the United States to whom the book was directed. Well, in his 1998 book, Betty Friedan and the Making of the Feminine Mystique, Smith College professor Daniel Horowitz, this book, he has dramatically refuted that claim. Professor Horowitz demonstrates in his book that the self-image Friedan painted was far, far different from her real-life history. He reveals a dark side to Friedan's social activism. Betty Friedan was a long-time participant, actually, in the American Communist movement. So, it turned out, Mommy was a commie. Daniel Horowitz establishes beyond doubt that the woman who has always presented herself as a typical suburban housewife until she began work on her groundbreaking book was in fact nothing of the kind. In fact, Under her maiden name, Betty Naomi Goldstein, she was a political activist and professional propagandist for the communist left for a quarter of a century before the publication of the feminist Mystique launched the modern women's movement. Here are some of the highlights of Friedan's hidden radical political past that Daniel Horowitz has brought to light in this book. As far back as her student days at Smith College, the future feminist leader lived in a world inhabited by those on the communist left. Young Betty Goldstein was first exposed to communist thinking while an undergraduate at Smith College in the late 1930s and early 1940s. While at Smith College, her leftist views were developed by the radical outlook of some of her professors and fellow students on the Northampton, Massachusetts campus of Smith College, those who pushed her in the direction of a full acceptance of the Soviet line. While Friedan was at Smith, people committed to liberal and left-wing positions dominated campus-wide public discussions, notes Professor Horowitz. He credits such an atmosphere with forming the ideology of Friedan, who later served the cause of international Marxism in various capacities. For example, in her junior year, she took an economics course with Dorothy Wolfe Douglas, a course on social movements and socialism taught by a woman who would serve as a role model for Betty. A wealthy and compelling person, Professor Douglas was a radical with capital R. In February of 1941, on Betty's 20th birthday, in a lecture on women in Nazi Germany, she recorded what Douglas had to say about the condition of women under German National Socialism. Professor Douglas mentioned what she called the feminist movement. In contrast, she talked about the traditionalism of the National Socialist attitude to women, children, and family. Nazis insisted, she noted Douglas as saying, on placing children at the center of family lives. Wow, that's concentration camp, wasn't it? During the summer of her junior year, 1941, guided by Professor Douglas, Betty even attended a summer course at a famous, or rather notorious, activist training camp, Highlander Folk School in Tennessee. Her biographer, Judith Hennessy, in this book comments, "The most profound thing that happened to Betty at Smith was her radicalization. She became committed to Marxist philosophy. Betty, yes, thrived at Smith, soaking up the ideas of leftist teachers and becoming the radical." Again, from this book, "She was the campus radical," an old friend said, "passionate, with wild hair, a firebrand." Beginning in 1940, while still a junior at Smith, she became an outspoken advocate of the Popular Front, a pro-communist umbrella that embraced a broad range of all kinds of leftist radical groups. She put her beliefs into practice. Betty was firebrand editor of the campus newspaper. According to biographer Daniel Horowitz, under Betty Goldstein, the Smith campus paper became notorious for its radicalism. Bob Easton, her first boyfriend there, whom she visited later at Harvard, remembered, and I quote again from biography written by Hennessy. He said, "I had lefty feelings, but not as much as she. She contributed to the Daily Worker." And the Daily Worker was the official newspaper of Communist Party USA. In 1942, Betty Goldstein graduated from Smith College, where she received a degree in psychology. Then she spent 1 year doing graduate work in psychology at Berkeley. While at Berkeley, her social milieu consisted of active members of the Communist Party, and her writings reflected a line directed from Moscow. She was a member of the Young Communist League, says Professor Horowitz on page 93 of this book. Horowitz also documents Betty's numerous personal close relationships with Communist Party operatives, including her romantic involvement with physicist David Bohm. A Communist Party member, Bohm worked on the Manhattan Project developing the atomic bomb. He would later invoke the Fifth Amendment while testifying in front of the U.S. Congress and leave the United States shortly thereafter. After leaving Berkeley, her first job in New York City was as a journalist at what was called Federated Press, America's premier leftist news service established by Communist Party members. It was the most sustained effort in American history, in Horowitz's words, to develop a left-wing news service. She worked there from 1943 to 1946. In 1944, Betty Goldstein made efforts to actually join the Communist Party and work for People's World, one of the party's newspapers, but was turned down because, according to her FBI file, I quote, "There already were too many intellectuals in the labor movement," says Professor Horowitz on page 93 of this book. And in 1944, an informant told the FBI that Frieden went to a party office in the East Bay Area, announced that she was already a member of the Young Communist League, and sought entrance to the party itself, as well as a job writing for its paper, the People's World, says Daniel Flynn in his article, Modern Feminism's Matriarch Unmasked. But yes, Frieden was indeed refused entry and was reportedly told that she could serve the Soviet cause better from outside of the official Communist Party. She would be more useful as a psychologist, and this is from her official biography, page 36. After being fired from Federated Press to make room for a man, or because of her excessively pro-Soviet positions, the evidence is not entirely clear. Her next job from 1946 to 1952 was as a staff reporter, some would say propagandist is the more accurate term, for UE News, the newspaper of the radical United Electrical, Radio and Machine Workers of America. According to historian Ronald Schatz, this labor union was, and I quote, "the largest communist-led institution of any kind in the United States." This union was among the most radical, most militant unions in the United States. In his authoritative book on the CIO, another historian, Robert Ziegler, states that UE was, I quote, "the only effectively led large pro-Soviet affiliate of the CIO in the post-war years." Betty Goldstein wrote articles also for the Daily Worker and New Masses that were both official Communist Party publications. In 1947, U.S. Congress targeted the UE as a communist front, and its membership began a steady decline. Well, the both outfits she worked for in her young years, the Federated Press and the UE News, were ostensibly union publications, but in reality were nothing but communist fronts. Well, again, "B'tach b'lo ta'aseh lecha milchama," by way of deception, thou shalt do war. Then she got married to Carl Frieden. His last name actually was Friedman, but for some reason they just dropped letter M. And if the home was a comfortable concentration camp, as Mrs. Frieden claimed in The Feminine Mystique, this is not something she really knew from her own experience. No, not at all. Living in a lavish mansion, she was freed from housework by the services of a full-time maid. Her husband earned a large salary and supported Betty and the children. The parents of her children's playmates even ejected Frieden from their carpooling arrangement when they learned that she sent their children to school in a taxi rather than driving them herself. The locked-up, middle-class homemaker that Friedan styled herself to be was an embroidered tale, says Daniel Flynn in his article Modern Feminism's Matriarch Unmasked. Her famous description of the American family household as a comfortable concentration camp in the feminine mystique, therefore, had much more to do with her Marxist leanings than with any of her actual experience as a housewife or mother, says David Horowitz, no relation to Daniel Horowitz, in his article Betty Friedan's Secret Communist Past, published in online Salon magazine on January 18, 1999. In her autobiography, Life So Far, Friedan portrays herself as a devoted housewife. But according to her ex-husband, Carl Friedan, Betty was no stay-at-home mom, not at all. Her ex-husband, also a leftist, by the way, complained that his wife, and I quote, was in the world during the whole marriage, had a full-time maid, and seldom was a wife and a mother. And he says, again, we had a full-time maid during our entire 19-year marriage. That's who took care of the 3 kids, cooked everything. He said, I would say as a housewife, on a scale of 0 to 10, she was a 2. End of quote. Carl Friedan's memories were not motivated by politics. He was, in fact, very proud of his ex-wife's accomplishments. And he says, I quote, I am proud of what she did for the world. Betty being monstrous in pursuit of her goals doesn't bother me at all. She changed the course of history almost single-handedly. And it took a monster, perhaps a driven, super-aggressive, egocentric, almost lunatic dynamo to rock the world the way she did. Unfortunately, she was the same person at home, where this kind of conduct does not work. End of quote. It is important to know that Daniel Horowitz did not intend to write his book as an expose. No, throughout the book, Horowitz is clearly sympathetic to Friedan's feminist objectives. Although Horowitz is a sympathetic leftist himself, still, Betty Friedan refused to cooperate with him once she realized he was going to tell the truth about her life as Betty Goldstein. After he published an initial article about Friedan's youthful work as a labor journalist, Friedan maligned him, saying to an American university audience, I quote her, she said, some historian recently wrote some attack on me in which he claimed that I was only pretending to be a suburban housewife, that I was supposed to be an agent. End of quote. This was particularly unkind because, as I said, Friedan's professor biographer is such a fellow traveler himself that he bends in this book over backwards throughout this book to sanitize the true dimensions of Friedan's past and defends, actually, Friedan's lying as a response to, well, surprise, surprise, McCarthyism. Horowitz claims that the fear of McCarthyism, a word that curiously graces this book's pages on more than 100 occasions, prevented Friedan from telling the truth about her activities during the 1940s and 1950s. As a Jew, a radical, and a woman, Friedan was particularly vulnerable to right-wing persecution, Horowitz says, and he chronicles the so-called Red Scare nightmares and concludes that Friedan realized that neither her writings nor feminist thought would gain currency if tainted with old left radicalism. The myth of the trapped housewife was a necessary fiction. Still, as I said, Betty Friedan refused to cooperate with Professor Horowitz and accused him of red biting. Why? Because her book, The Feminine Mystique, would not have sold over 5 million copies if her subversive background were known. Communists operate by subterfuge, pretending to be just like us. Well, בטח לא תעשה לך מלחמה. Once Frieden became famous, Horowitz complains, journalists, authors of standard reference works, and historians simply repeated the narrative of her life offered in the Feminine Mystique and elsewhere, like in her autobiography and official biography. Because those writings about Frieden so often sympathize with her views, they didn't bother to investigate her past and instead relied on her word. Horowitz himself questioned whether it was appropriate to make public the inconvenient information he discovered about Frieden. Horowitz claims that we live in, and I quote, he says, "We live in a world where Pat Buchanan and the Christian Coalition are powerful, if not consistently ascendant. So I worried that I might be revealing elements of Frieden's past that conservatives could use to discredit not only Frieden, but the entire women's movement." End of quote. This is from page 10 in this book. Well, anyways, no one seriously believes that people who reveal their communist past these days have anything to fear from the American government or society. Angela Davis, for example, was the Communist Party's candidate for vice president and served the Soviet Empire until its very last gasp. Her punishment for this is to have been appointed one of only 7 president's professors at the state-run University of California, and to be officially invited at exorbitant fees by college administrations all across the country to give ceremonial speeches on public occasions, including twice to U of O, and once she spoke at Holt Center in Eugene. Betty Friedan was not a suburban housewife when she wrote her book, but a 25-year veteran of professional journalism in the communist left, where she had been indoctrinated in the politics of the woman question, and specifically the idea that women were oppressed. Not at all a neophyte when it came to the woman question. The phrase itself, by the way, is a Marxist construction. She was certainly familiar with the writings of Marx, Engels, and Lenin on the subject and had written about it herself as a journalist for the official publication of the communist-controlled media. She was a professional Marxist ideologist. Betty Friedan has been exposed as a fraud. Feminism deserves such a matriarch. These are words of Daniel Flynn from his book called Intellectual Morons, How Ideology Makes Smart People Fall for Stupid Ideas, published in year 2004, page 229. Moreover, what I want to add here is that in her rather candid autobiography, My Life So Far, published in year 2000, Friedan says that no matter what she did, her mother made her feel, and I quote, messy, clumsy, inadequate, bad, naughty, ugly. This is from page 26 in this book. Friedan spent years in psychoanalysis, and I quote, talking endlessly about how I hated my mother and how she had killed my father. This is from page 123. Also, all mothers should be drowned at birth, she used to say in her 20s, page 31. Also, ostracized by her classmates, Friedan vowed that, I quote, they may not like me, but one day they are going to have to look up to me. Well, people like Friedan prefer to change the world rather than heal themselves, deal with their own personal problems. They tend to do very well by what they think is doing good. Boredom plays a role here as well. It is impossible to observe radical feminists without thinking that their assertions of oppression and victimization Their never-ending search for fresh grievances are ways of giving meaning to lives that would otherwise seem sterile to them. Self-pity and envy are also undoubtedly factors, says Judge Robert Bork in his book Slouching Toward Gomorrah, page 10. The freedoms of this world, some very nasty woman, some very ugly feminist, or as the New York Times describes them, and I quote, by the standards of the time, unlovely, is a classic communist popular front, subversive movement today. Well, that's much about freedom. Another such, by the standards of the time, unlovely woman is, of course, Gloria Steinem. Steinem's most dazzling accomplishment was coming up with the saying that I quoted last time. She said, a woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle. But she also has always maintained that she is a leftist radical. When I was in college, it was the McCarthy era, she told in one interview in 1997, and that made me a Marxist. Well, she also collaborated with the CIA, ratted on comrades, and helped to provoke riots. Later, Steinem joined the so-called Democratic Socialists of America. She served as, and still serves, I think, as an honorary chair of the Democratic Socialists of America, which boasts as being the largest socialist organization in the United States. And she became a media darling due to her CIA connections. And MS magazine, which she edited for many years, was actually indirectly funded by the CIA. And she coined two phrases that we can hear everywhere today, reproductive freedom and pro-choice. And actually in the 1980s, she dated Henry Kissinger. Well, some consider Gloria Steinem probably the second most influential feminist leader after Friedan, but myself, I don't find her interesting, so I better skip her and better talk about Andrea Rita Dworkin from the New Left, who was a militant feminist, once described as the Malcolm X of the women's movement. She was called provocative icon of the women's movement by Adam Bernstein in Washington Post obituary when she finally expired a few years ago. She was also called a spearhead of radical feminism by the British Guardian. I am a radical feminist, she said of herself, not the fun kind. She was the real thing, said Catherine Weiner of The Guardian in obituary. Well, Andrea Dworkin was perhaps the archetype of what Rush Limbaugh termed feminazi. Born to a Jewish family in Camden, New Jersey, she was embroiled in controversy from an early age. In the obituary after her death, the Washington Post writer Adam Bernstein said, and I quote, encouraged by her socially conscious father, Ms. Dworkin embraced dissent at an early age. She refused to sing Christmas carols in elementary schools, and by sixth grade decided she wanted to change restrictive abortion laws. Well, it is not likely that an 11-year-old girl like, oh my God, would worry unencouraged about abortion laws. Well, Andrea Dworkin said in her memoirs, I have here her memoirs, that she had indeed a very good relationship with her father, whom she credits with introducing her to the world of ideas. In her own words, he was a committed, dedicated socialist and inspired her political leanings. Also, in one interview, Dworkin described her Jewish childhood as being in many ways dominated by family memories of the Holocaust. At a time when the subject was simply not mentioned, Dworkin says she was obsessed with that subject. And I quote her, I have been very involved in trying to learn about the Holocaust and trying to understand it, which is probably pointless, she said. I have read Holocaust material, you might say compulsively, over a lifetime. I have been doing that since I was a kid. This is from her interview in The Guardian on April 12, 2005. No, this is not from interview, this is from obituary, actually. Of course, she died in 2005. In another interview, she says that she was a good Jewish girl in a pro-Israel home. And all of my remaining family are, I would say, Zionist zealots. She said in the interview, also in The Guardian. She is a very Jewish Jew, said the interviewer, Linda Grant, a British journalist and novelist who is Jewish herself. Dworkin even said once in the same interview to British Guardian, I wanted to be the rabbi. In the long autobiographical essay she wrote in 1994, Dworkin says that she, and I quote, began to think about survival very early, in part because we were Jewish on the heels of the Holocaust. And so, growing up Jewish, she later wrote, informed her views on feminism. And I quote her, being a Jew, one learns to believe in the reality of cruelty, and one learns to recognize indifference to human suffering as a fact. This is from her interview in British Times. Well, just like Betty Friedan's comfortable concentration camp theory. Throughout high school, she was, to use her own words, from messing with men, earning through prostitution the money she needed for her frequent forays into Greenwich Village in New York, where she became acquainted with New York's bohemians, among them Allen Ginsberg, whom she greatly admired. Andrea Dworkin wrote actually very openly about the experience as a prostitute. She made frequent trips to New York, paying her bus fare, she said, by finding some stupid man and basically exchange sex for money. This is how she puts it. In 1964, with scholarships and some loans taken out by her father, she went to Bennington College in Vermont, where she continued her erratic studies of literature and philosophy, distracting herself with drugs, sex, and politics. This I took from online Jewish Woman Encyclopedia. One of her favorite books at that time was Che Guevara's Guerrilla Warfare. I read it 1,000,000 times, Dworkin told an interviewer in year 2000. I would plan attacks on the local shopping mall. Well, then she first hit the headlines in 1965 as a college freshman when she reported experiencing humiliating body searches at a women's detention center after arrest at the United Nations for protesting the Vietnam War. Her graphic description of her ordeal was then reported in newspapers across the world, and the downtown Bastille was subsequently closed down in New York. Well, as David Roberts says in his article titled A Post-Mortem Analysis of Andrea Dworkin, published in April of 2005, and I quote, in the detention center after her arrest, her clever mind figured out that if she told a pack of lies about the indignity of the way she was treated, she could attract attention. This plan worked so well that one sees her repeating this pattern for the rest of her life. End of quote. By way of deception, we should wage war. Well, she got so good at spinning this line that she was eventually invited to Harvard to lecture on patriarchal oppression. Such is the stuff that most women's studies programs in our colleges and universities are made of. But her parents, humiliated by the public scandal, turned against her, and in 1968, after graduating from Bennington, Andrea Dworkin moved to Amsterdam and married there some crazy Dutch anarchist, a man who would burn her with cigarettes and beat her savagely. After 3 years, she managed to escape from him. And she said, I quote, "Not because I knew that he would kill me, but because I thought I would kill him." Then in the Netherlands for a while, she was a prostitute again, until she met Ricky Abrams, a feminist and fellow expatriate who sheltered Dworkin in her home in the Netherlands and helped her find places to stay on houseboats, a communal farm, or some deserted buildings. Abrams introduced Dworkin to early radical feminist writings from the United States. Then Dworkin herself wrote her first book, which she titled Woman Hating. It was published in 1974 after she came back to the United States. And she declared the book's objective was, I quote, was to destroy patriarchal power at its source, the family, and in its most hideous form, the national state. Returning to the USA and now identifying as lesbian, in 1974 she met writer and activist John Stoltenberg when they both walked out on a poetry reading in Greenwich Village over misogynist material, as she put it. They became close friends and eventually came to live together. But she continued to publicly identify herself as lesbian, and he was a gay. Bizarre. Stoltenberg recounted the perplexity that their relationship seemed to cause people in the press. Summarized the relationship by saying, and I quote him, "So I state only the simplest facts publicly. Yes, Andrea and I live together and love each other, and we are each other's life partner. And yes, we are both out." Well, Dworkin and Stoltenberg eventually even got married in 1998. After her death, Stoltenberg said, I quote, "It is why we never told anybody really that we married, because people get confused about that. They think, oh, she's yours, and we just did not want that nonsense." End of quote. Bizarre, isn't it? Mr. Stoltenberg is the author of 2 books, Refusing to be a Man, and another book, The End of Manhood. While his wife, radical feminist and lesbian Andrea Dworkin, authored 10 books of radical feminist theory and practice and numerous speeches and articles. She put forth a number of shocking theses about male-female relationships and spent her career as a radical feminist inciting hatred against man. Here are just a few random quotes from her publications that show how she demonized man. She said, for example, "I want to see a man beaten to a bloody pulp with a high heel shoved in his mouth like an apple in the mouth of a pig." End of quote. She also said, "Marriage is a legal license to rape." And how about this one? She said, "All men benefit from rape because all men benefit from the fact that women are not free in this society." Well, feminists want to give her today a kind of sainthood. She was a bedrock, the place to start from. Even when you disagreed with her, her arguments were infuriating, fascinating, hard to forget, says Catherine Weiner in the Guardian obituary. When a newspaper interviewer asked her how she would like to be remembered, Dworkin said, I quote, "In a museum, when male supremacy is dead, I would like my work to be an anthropological artifact from an extinct primitive society." Gloria Steinem, who has been a close friend of Dworkin's for more than 30 years, repeatedly compared her to the Old Testament prophets. Actually, this is on back cover of her autobiography. As Gloria Steinem also said, and I quote, "In every century there are a handful of writers who helped the human race evolve. Andrea is one of them." Catherine McKinnon, Dworkin's longtime friend and collaborator, published a column in the New York Times celebrating what she described as Dworkin's incandescent literary and political career, and suggested that Dworkin deserved a nomination for the Nobel Prize in Literature. But, well, regardless of what I think about her, I also must admit that there were a few things she said I too agree with. For example, with her idea that rape victims should be allowed to personally execute their attackers. Good. Dworkin said that a semi-automatic gun is one answer to the problem of violence against women. And she also advocated and called for the assassination, she said, of pedophiles. And my favorite Dworkin moment was the story of her longtime rivalry with Allen Ginsberg, who apparently said pompously, "You know, the right wants me in jail." And Dworkin supposedly responded, "Yes, I know, they are so sentimental, I would kill you." And as we know, Ginsberg was a notorious pedophile, member of NAMBLA, North American Man-Boy Love Association. Who doesn't know? Well, as Adam Bernstein says in the Washington Post obituary, she was far happier as a provocateur than a politician. By many accounts, she was a galvanizing presence at all feminist rallies. Although Dworkin's books, filled with descriptions of what she considers the inherent violence of heterosexual relations, were repeatedly rejected by U.S. publishers, she succeeded in having them published most in the United Kingdom, where they enjoyed an enormous critical and popular success. But her novels were not popular even when published. The Literary Review described one of her novels as grossly disgusting. Well, I'm not going to talk about all her books because we don't have enough time for that. I'll mention only a few very briefly. Perhaps her best-known book is called Pornography, Man Possessing Woman, published in 1981. The book received positive attention from unlikely quarters, including Punch magazine, which said she writes like a Leon Trotsky of the sex war. Dworkin campaigned ferociously against pornography. And here I also agree with her. And she argued that pornography was an instruction manual for rape. She regarded pornography as akin to terrorism even. But some fellow feminists objected to her crusade against pornography as an infringement on women's choice of how to use their bodies, and civil libertarians, of course, opposed it as an assault on the First Amendment. With law professor Catherine McKinnon, she wrote an ordinance passed by the city of Indianapolis that defined pornography as a kind of speech crime that violated the civil rights of all women. The law was later overturned as unconstitutional. But Dworkin's anti-pornography crusade, by the way, resulted in a notorious Canadian censorship law. And the funniest thing is that in 1993, copies of Dworkin's book Pornography were held for inspection by Canada's customs agents. So Dworkin's own book had been banned from Canada under a law that she herself had promoted. In year 2000, she published what she believed to be her life's work, 9 years in the making, a book called Scapegoat, the Jews, Israel, and Women's Liberation. Throughout history, argues Dworkin, women and Jews have been stigmatized as society's scapegoats. So in this book, she compares the oppression of women to the persecution of Jews, discusses the sexual politics of Jewish identity and anti-Semitism. And she came to endorse a bizarre version of lesbian separatism, calling for the establishment of a woman's homeland with land and guns as a response to the oppression of women. Well, here are a few reviews. Scapegoat, the book is an alarming, confrontational, full-tilt boogie through the vast catalog of injustices and horrors, individual and institutional, that have been visited on women and Jews through the ages, in a florid, violent, and accusatory synthesis of two different strands of classic victimology, says Julia Grayson in an article Andrea Dworkin in Agony, published in an online Salon magazine on September 20, 2000. Another review. It is an analysis of the Holocaust in Israel through the eye of gender relations, drawing together strands of Zionism, feminism, and Holocaust studies to produce a radical new thesis that the Jews downtrodden had to fight back, and that women downtrodden must do the same. This is from British Guardian. Yet another. Dworkin makes comparisons between phenomena like rape and pogroms, Nazi hate literature and pornography. The parallels she draws are not particularly original, but no one denies the importance of pointing out the way that one often similar persecution of Jews and women illustrates the dark side of human behavior in situations of unequal power. End of quote. For most of history, Dworkin says, women and Jews have had little or no capability or strength of their own, and thus have simply and nobly and righteously and innocently suffered. In Scapegoat, Dworkin makes a direct comparison between anti-Semitism and sexism on the one hand, and between Zionism and woman liberation or feminism on the other. The Israelis are my guys, she wrote, going on to justify the conquest of the Palestinian land as being the result of centuries of anti-Semitic violence. But what she found in Israel, well, was, as she says, a male-dominated militaristic society. Well, it is a historic fact, by the way, that the rabbis had to declare Golda Meir an honorary male before they could recognize her as Prime Minister of Israel. Anyways, Dworkin argued that the victimization of Jewish men in pogroms plus Holocaust had led to their determination to demonstrate their masculinity by fighting to create a Jewish state, but over time that masculinity led to machoistic approach to Israeli women as well as to the Arab enemies. Dworkin's most original conclusion to all this is that women need land and guns. Women must reject pacifism and literally create their own militant separatist territory, womanland. As a practical concept, of course, the idea is nothing short of nuts, says Julia Grayson in Salon magazine. Dworkin also does not seem to see the inconsistency between her own blistering, demonizing prose and her condemnations of hate speech and hate literature. She said, words make killing easier, legitimate, or inevitable. Words can kill. Why, then, does Dworkin spew so much intemperate rhetoric herself? Rhetoric that overtly justifies violence, because it seems the people she is scapegoating deserve it. And then, in June 2000, Andrea Dworkin published two controversial articles in British newspapers, New Statesman and The Guardian, stating that one or more men had raped her in her hotel room in Paris the previous year, putting drugs in her drink to disable her. In May of 1999, while reading a book on French literary fascism and sipping a Kir Royale in its Paris hotel garden, Dworkin was, according to her account, slipped some kind of drug by a barman. Back in her room, reeling from the narcotic, she was savagely raped by two hotel staff members, she believed by the same barman and a waiter, she said. This was, as later described by British author and journalist Charlotte Raven, a widely disbelieved claim. Well, as it could be expected, Still, her articles ignited quite a bit of public controversy, polarizing opinion between skeptics and supporters. Seizing upon inconsistencies in her two essays about the incident published in The Guardian and The New Statesman, and her failure to contact hotel security or police, many even among her fellow feminists suggested the rape did not happen. Dworkin seems to think her story should be taken as further evidence of masculine malevolence, said Julia Grayson in Salon's article. I think it is fair to say that few people believed Andrea Dworkin's account of her drug rape in a Paris hotel room in 1999. Even sympathetic obituarists felt bound to suggest that the catalog of abuse that followed Dworkin all her life and which fueled her writings was viewed with suspicion in many quarters, says Deborah Orr in obituary published by The Independent. Dworkin, an anti-rape activist who has devoted much time and energy to battling the crime, decided not to inform the police or hotel security when she realized what had happened to her, says another obituarist. Even Dworkin's so-called husband, gay feminist John Stoltenberg, who by that time has lived with Dworkin for 25 years, did not really believe her. John looked for any other explanation than rape, Dworkin writes. He abandoned me emotionally. This response, though, did not surprise Dworkin. If the Holocaust can be denied even today, she said, how can a woman who has been raped be believed? She said. Well, some commentators even claim that the rape most likely occurred in her dreams. Michael Lamport Commons, a researcher with Harvard Medical School's program in psychiatry and law, said, for example, I quote him, lying is a concept of free will. People have to know that they are telling untruths in order to be justifiably called liars. He was not sure that that is the case with Dworkin. And he said, while rare, people have dreams of being raped, which appear real to them. Many character disorders, including borderline personality, involve lying and not knowing one lies. End of quote. Well, as I see it, her obsession with rape possibly led her to fantasize about having been herself a victim of rape, to become deluded that she had, in fact, been raped herself. I believe that the reason why Dworkin was so extreme in her beliefs about men was because she experienced an extreme life, not just as a woman, but as an unattractive, clever woman, says Deborah Orr from The Independent. As Deborah Orr says, for yet more, though, Dworkin was simply too fat and ugly to receive any sexual attention at all, and a nutcase to boot. Yes, even in obituaries, after her death, what is very unusual, many writers didn't fail to mention how ugly she was. She indeed, it's enough just to look at her photo. She indeed was morbidly obese, devastatingly ugly, and repulsive in every conceivable way. While the majority of women seek to be attractive, Dworkin sought to be ugly. Her refusal to make any concessions to feminine beauty was bound up in her philosophy, of course, not least because while some women regarded it as an act of bravery, others saw it as a symptom of her problems. Dworkin pretends to be a daring truth-teller, wrote the feminist Camille Paglia, but never mentions her most obvious problem, food. In Dworkin's obituary, The Guardian quotes writer Mimi Spencer, who wrote about Andrea Dworkin that, I quote, she looks as though she neither waxes, nor washes, nor flushes, nor flosses. And so, being fat and hairy, she was obsessed about rape because no man would ever want her. It just seemed like to imagine, let's say, Sally Shecklow to be raped. That's beyond my imagination. Even reading obituary in such liberal leftist publication as The Nation, I found this, I quote, Andrea Dworkin was a living visual stereotype. The feminist as fat, hairy, makeup-scorning, unkempt lesbian. Perhaps that was one reason she was such a media icon. She proved that feminism was for women who couldn't get a man. This is from The Nation, May 2nd, 2005, obituary after Dworkin's death. But I like most how one internet blogger put it that, and I quote him, the only reason Andrea Dworkin says the stuff she says is because she's stomach-churningly ugly. And he writes, Dworkin reminds me of some talentless non-entity stating that they are poor and unknown because they made a conscious decision not to be rich and famous, as if these latter possibilities were ever on the cards. Andrea could be profitably employed by Scotland's tourist industry to swim up and down Loch Ness to lure in hordes of visitors hoping to see the monster. And they wouldn't be disappointed. God, what a sight. Yeah, she was ugly and bitter, the personification of female resentment. So naturally, Dworkin vilified men. Her reasons were both systematic and personal. On the personal level, her abuse of men and denigration of heterosexuality reflected her low self-esteem and befuddled intellect. It is a case of hating the thing you want the most. She made herself deliberately ugly in order to defy men. She became a woman who couldn't get raped even if she wanted. Being ugly, unwashed, unkept were things she wore on her sleeve and the rest of her body. In fact, her gross obesity became so severe that it led to her premature death. In a way, so it was a death at the hands of feminism. There were also political reasons for her man-hating, of course. There is a powerful feminist requirement to have such an ideology, that all men are bastards, rapists, exploiters. Feminism seeks alienation between man and woman. That's all they do. I said last Friday that as the women's movement turned fanatical and ugly in the 1960s and 1970s, when persons like Betty Friedan and Andrea Dworkin took over, the focus began to shift from reform and equal opportunity. The feminist leaders such as Friedan and Dworkin, humorless, militant, pugnacious, and angry with their particular lot in life, fostered a virulent hatred of anything having to do with males. They no longer wanted to equalize the status of woman, but instead wanted to irreversibly alienate woman from man and vice versa. Only when manhood is dead, and it will perish when ravaged femininity no longer sustains it. Only then will we know what it is to be free. Andrea Dworkin, in her speech on September 26, 1975, at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, said, above her desk in her New York home was a poster that said, "Dead men don't rape." Well, I repeat, it is the campaign to turn women against men on the grounds that they all are rapists. And no one doubts that some men are rapists, but this is no way establishes that all men are. And here we finish now, and we'll continue next Friday, since we have that opportunity, and we will talk about the fruits of radical feminism. And we still have 15 minutes.
No, well, yeah, you have about 35 seconds yet to speak, and we have 15 minutes for Q&A.
Yeah, I finished.
Good, perfect timing.
Yeah.
So we have 15 minutes left for questions. Who's first? Who's burning? Edwin.
Why would the CIA want to support Ms. Magazine?
Well, that's a long story, and I should talk for another at least 20 minutes how that thing happened, and maybe for an hour and a half. So. Well, CIA supported many magazines. There was this cultural, how to say, against influence of KGB, basically. So I can't really just answer in 2 words. I even think but yeah, we can talk sometime about that. That's interesting topic about how the CIA supported all those neocons, basically, like Irving Kristol was editor of this magazine, how it called in London? I forgot. So that was supported by the CIA. Yeah, we can do sometime this. Yeah, I study those things in great detail.
Feminism into a search engine, and it came out very simply that feminism is just for equal rights for women in all areas. By that definition, would you say you're a feminist?
I don't believe women have equal rights.
Should they have equal rights?
Should they have,
that they're
for instance, what areas politically?
Everything.
I believe that women should have equal rights with men.
Marvel, do you believe that women should have equal rights in all areas?
I don't have a considered opinion on that. The question has too many implications.
How about you?
Well, I have an opinion and very firm belief that women do have equal rights, and if not in all areas, so at 99% of areas, as you can. Well, I don't know. We have Hillary Clinton as state secretary. We have woman as president in Lithuania now, and we just can look around, and I think.
That's ideal then for you. It's good.
Well, if my country's president is a woman, so well, what else rights we can have? Hillary was running for president of the United States. No, I'm not against, feminism. I don't know what it means. I'm not against.
What it says on the internet, it just says equal rights.
Well, you can find many things on the internet. I found many stuff that I just quoted today on the internet, but feminism, I wouldn't call this feminism. It was like, movement for equal rights for women, like to vote, let's say. I can't pronounce that. Suffragettes, suffragettes. Yeah, movement. So that was as far from feminism as I don't know. Fish from bicycle.
Seems to be a conflict.
So I support the woman's right to vote, of course, and I support a woman's right to become a president of the United States, but I don't support women's right to be, to beat me to focus as I'm doing.
And there's another question about this.
Huh?
Mike.
Yeah.
Last week, I put off asking questions because I was hoping it would be filled in this week.
Yeah.
But last week, I didn't find any content to the discussion. What I did hear was a caricature of the feminist movement that I don't think anybody who lived through it would recognize. And that caricature was largely painted by people you quoted who disagreed with the feminist movement. I didn't hear either really in their quotes or any of your analysis what it was that was disagreed with. What I did hear was a lot of what I heard today was quotes that were sneered at as if it was self-obvious what was wrong with the quotations, with no specific critique.
Examples?
With no specific critique being made. Okay, you can play back the recording and listen to quotation after quotation quotation after
Can
quotation.
you pull out one example that we can hone in on for?
Yeah, I could just,
No, I won't, because I have more I want to say, and then I'll come back and give specifics if you like.
Okay.
What happened today was a character assassination of one major, influential, both ideologically and organizationally, person in the feminist movement, and the character assassination of another who was a minor, non-influential person, either ideologically or organizationally, who was an easy target. That's a particularly vicious, personal character assassination, and in a place where we hear so often that ad hominem arguments are not to be heard or presented. I found the entire hour and a quarter one extended ad hominem argument against these two people, and by implication against the movement that has never been fairly represented. Okay, either in terms of what the movement itself says, or in terms of the critique that's being made of it. It's easy to set up straw men, or straw women in this case, who represent something that we disagree with, and then say what it is that we disagree, where they themselves have never represented that notion. And that's what I find happening here in this entire critique of feminism. Frieden and Steinman were not radical feminists. And most of the people that were being quoted last week were not radical feminists.
Thank you. Do you have a question?
No, I could say that.
No, I have remarks here,
Yep.
and those are my remarks.
Thank you.
Well, I would say, what is a movement? People make movement. They are leaders of movement. And, of course, there were some feminists, as mentioned by me, Tammy Bruce, who finally just quit that movement, and now she writes books about it. And I don't in no way would imply that like thousands and thousands of just foot soldiers of feminist movement are just as bad as Betty Friedan was, or Dworkin, or Steinem, or others. But that is leadership. That's their leadership. And what I wanted to expose today, and yes, I agree with you that this is character assassination. Any exposure is character assassination. Because by showing how nasty were these two women, well, you just kind of show that fish rots from head, if I put this correct way, and that Betty Friedan was lying about her being communist. That's not my discovery, but Professor Horowitz's, who wrote a fairly big book about it, and he's even sympathetic to Friedan, and that Andrea Dworkin was really ugly, so you can see photo, and she really was, and that she was nasty as hell. So she writes in her autobiography. And while it's hard to imagine to me, but they're saying that about dead people you say only good things or nothing. But when I read all those obituaries after her death that are still available on the internet, and when you read obituary of someone who just died, so it's really shocking when even those who write obituaries, that's how ugly and nasty she was. So she probably was. I don't know. I never met her, and well, lucky me. But probably she was. So yes, I agree with you that these are character assassinations, and just as those on the left, like Portland's Antifa, how they assassinate us, like Tim Colbert in Portland, so well we have to beat them back, and this is what I do. They declared war on us, so, well, we should accommodate them and assassinate their icons, like Betty Friedan and Dworkin and all others, liberals and communists and anarchists. Yes, we should assassinate.
That's the content and a genuine critique, perhaps, of what feminists actually say. In fact, when can we expect, maybe, and I'd be interested in hearing this, the basis from which you make criticisms? What are the positive values that you hold? How would you like society to be so that we might understand, held against these standards, how it is that you critique what we have come to be and the way we have come to be it?
Well, this is all sophistry. As I say, there's war, there are enemies, and you fight your enemies. And those are my enemies. So I don't care about their positive little bits. They're enemies, like the Germans were enemies in World War II, or like that. This is not about critique or positive things. If you want to hear positive things, so you can, when school year starts, I can guarantee you that during school year there would be at least a dozen of feminist speakers on this campus very positive about feminism, so you can choose from all those speakers, including, I don't know, let's hope maybe Angela Davis would come for fourth time to Eugene, or Gloria Steinem. I believe she was here once. And but how often you hear assassination of that movement?
Well, every time I come here, where will you
Oh, this is what the Pacific.
to go someplace else? Did you hear him say that? To hear something positive, people should go someplace else.
Well, yes, partially I agree with you that this is form for critique, and we hear critique from culture of critique, of Frankfurt School critique about everything, about Nazis, Holocaust deniers, supremacists, racists, and fundamentalists, traditionalists, go and go and go, but nobody really nowadays even dare to say something against the left, against anti-fascists, against feminists, against homosexual activists. So this is what I do. Well, I don't say that Pacifica Forum as anarchistic group is devoted to attack such leftist movements and persons, but myself, and I speak for myself, yes, my purpose here is to attack Zionist, feminist, communist, anarchist, and you name it. That's, I think, the explanation. Yes.
Yeah, I just think I really loved the lecture. But I think you missed an opportunity. Last week you brought Christine Hoff Sommer's book with you. And she has made some really telling criticisms of the feminist movement from the point of view of a different kind of feminist.
Great
answer. I think she did. And I just wondered if maybe you would agree that you might have mentioned her along the way to support some of your points.
What I can say, yeah, she made some good points there, and it was a good book, but a little bit too dry for me, I would say, too dry, because I read so many books, and I didn't get hooked by that book. It's sort of like, she repeats things, and then kind of tries to be nice, and not to, while Tammy Bruce, my new discovery, and she's really good. She is former feminist. She quit the feminist. She's still lesbian, and she just hits right where it belongs. With character assassinations, with totally. So I like more of her book. But yeah, I really admire Summers. Yes, I read her book and I had it. And maybe next week I will bring something. I have quite a few pieces I copied from that book.
It sounded like you thought the ideal family situation was that the woman stays home and has 6 babies. And
Yes, absolutely.
And the guy goes out and
Work and earns enough for to feed family.
Is that just being humorous, or is that...
No, absolutely.
Absolutely.
I agree that if
I
women
also-
can...
Maybe not 6. I just did that. I just got to spend 25 years raising my children myself while my husband
managed
worked.
They should never go out, even if the kids are grown, they shouldn't go out and have a career? Or what?
Not if they want, they can have career, but
Who else will raise the children?
yeah, well, children should come first. Family should come first, and if she can afford that, and her husband can earn enough money, unfortunately, well, nowadays it's unrealistic. But yeah, that's ideal. That's ideal. And women should be supported by the state, or how it used to be in Europe up till recently, or what was called like welfare states, from cradle to grave welfare states. So women could, after giving birth, they had like 2 years. Well, they still have it in Lithuania, yeah. So it's, that's ideal, but everything is just
Germany.
destroyed.
Yeah.
Germany.
And we're right at 4:30.
Yeah.
So that's a wrap.
And next week I will talk about what happened to families, to children, to women, that's terrible things, but little dry statistics.
Thank you.
Nothing so you could afford. Yeah, well.